Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Dipali Dewan. I'm the Dan Mishra Curator for Global South Asia at the Royal Ontario Museum. Thank you for joining us. This digital event is Remembering Indo-Caribbean Legacies Through Art. Before I begin, I'd like to say that ROM acknowledges that it sits on the ancestral lands of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Anishinaabeg Nation, which includes the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, who have been the original stewards of the land since time immemorial to today. I'd also like to add that my ancestors come from Northern England and Northern India. I'm the product of colonial encounters and multiple migrations that have led me to be a settler on this land. As a diasporic person, I'm committed to understanding the history that has allowed me to settle here and my responsibilities to it. These include thanking the ancestors of this land, sharing resources, making sure the history of harm to Indigenous communities does not repeat itself, and being proactive in my own learning journey. So today's program explores the histories of Indo-Caribbean indentureship through a feminist and decolonial lens, featuring ceramic artist Heidi McKenzie and scholar Nalini Mohabir. It is supported by the Dan Mishra South Asian Initiative. And with that, I'd like to invite my guests to turn on their cameras as I introduce them. So Heidi McKenzie is a ceramic and installation artist based in Toronto, Canada. Heidi completed her MFA at OCAD-U in 2014. Her art practice is informed by her mixed race Indo-Trinidadian and Irish American heritage. And Heidi uses ceramics, photography, digital media, and archival imagery to explore themes of ancestry, race, migration, and colonialization in her works, as well as themes of body and healing. Heidi has exhibited widely in Canada and internationally. Hi, Heidi. Professor Nalini Mohabir is an associate professor in the Department of Geography, Planning, and Environment at Concordia University. Her research focus is Caribbean studies and begins with indentureship, which she explores through oral histories, literature, art, and archives. She is published in several academic journals. I'd like to invite everybody to feel free to leave questions during the conversation and in your thoughts in the Q&A feature, which should be somewhere in the bottom of your screen. We will address them at the end. I also want to say that today's program comes at a time of change at the ROM. We're undergoing an exciting renovation project that will reimagine the entryway and first floor into even more of a community hub. Part of this is the redesign and expansion of the South Asia Gallery that will bring in global stories of the art and culture of this region and its diaspora, including a dedicated space for Sikh art and culture. This is scheduled for 2028. Also in the works is an exhibition devoted to the art, culture, and nature of the Indian Ocean, a space defined by the monsoon winds that has resulted in a long history of travel, exchange, and innovation that still shapes our world today, and that's scheduled to open in 2026. So I hope all of you sort of look forward to those two really large, relevant projects. So with that, I'm going to start sharing my screen. And I'm really happy to say that today's program debuts ROM's acquisition of two of Heidi's works into the collection. And I'd like to start with these. You will be able to see them in the exhibition and gallery projects that I just mentioned. One of them is on the screen here, and I'll show you an image of the other one shortly. So with that, I'd like to start our conversation. And Heidi, I'm hoping you can help me introduce these two works that are now part of the ROM collection to our audience. And you have to unmute yourself.
Thank you. As you can see, this is a sculpture of an abstraction of a ship. Um, and I called it First Wave because it came about when I just got so excited in 2020, May of 2020. The National Archives of Trinidad and Tobago released for the very first time to the public the ship's manifest of the first, well, any ship's manifest, but this is the ship's manifest of the first ship that brought Indian workers from Calcutta to Trinidad, and it's called the Fatal Razak. Well, this is obviously a representation of it, but the manifest, as soon as I saw it, I knew I had to make something with it. And I think it's really ironic because I made this thinking, well, I'm making this for me. This is never going to really be seen. And here we are.
Voila.
Um, but can I just talk to you a little bit about the making of it or describe it?
Um,
I'll just describe a
yeah,
little.
just go ahead quickly with just the material used.
Right. So I made the base of the ship out of like a stoneware, and you'll see images on the ship, and that's a decal method where we fire photography onto the ship, and the portholes actually have the coins that were used at the time that the ship traveled in 1845. Um,
Details.
yeah, those are the details, and the sails have, as I mentioned, the ship's manifest, and so I just wanted to really show you that it took me a while to figure out how to do the sails in porcelain. And I ended up chiseling out the shape of the sail and firing it in my kiln that way, and then refiring it with the the images on them.
And
So
so just to kind of reiterate, this is a ceramic piece, but there's two different kinds of ceramics being used here. And the sails were handmade by you, and then the manifest was attached through a kind of photo reproduction decal.
that's correct. Yeah.
So help me talk about this work. And this is the other work that was acquired into the ROMS collection, part of a series of Heidi's works.
So this came first or earlier. And I guess it came about because I came suddenly into the possession through a cousin of mine of a photograph of my great great grandmother, Runia. I think she's there on the left, the furthest photo on the left. Um, and I just got really excited, and I didn't really fully understand the history of these women who came. And I don't know, I won't get into the, I'm sure we're going to talk more about that later. But I just read a lot about and researched and started interviewing, and it just became really important for me to illuminate these women's lives because they were untold, forgotten, and you know, they were exoticized, they were anonymized, and they worked really hard labor in the sugarcane fields. And so I just to show you really briefly about the making, these are hand pressed, what I call porcelaneous stoneware because it's not fired as high as porcelain. The photography is transferred onto a fired tile, and the iron oxide in the image itself burns to this beautiful archival sepia-rich tone. So that's that's what are in there. And they literally become illuminated with a lamp, an LED light.
And so these tiles have been put together in a kind of lantern-like form.
Mhm.
And you've included a photograph of your great 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 grandmother,
Two greats, two
um,
greats, two
two
greats.
great 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 grandmother, alongside images of other women who came as workers from India to the Caribbean. And I just want to show also an image of how the series looks illuminated. So illuminated refers in the title refers to, in some ways, bringing light to the women's lives, as well as the sort of literal aspect of the lantern.
Mhm.
So I want to step back a little bit and Nalini, maybe ask you at this point, to give us a few guideposts on the history of Indian indenture in the Caribbean. Why has it been called the new slavery?
Thank you, Dipali. And I also just wanted to say thank you to the ROM for creating this space for indentured stories to be told, and Heidi for your images. I guess we should start by defining what indentureship is. Um, I think of it as an involuntary form of labor, confined and compelled by contract to labor on plantations, usually sugar plantations in the Caribbean. It was for a specified time period, at a minimum 5 years, often 10 years or more, at least 10 if one wanted to return back to India. It still has, this is a form of labor from the 19th century. It still has relevance today. Scholars often think about it in comparison to Canada's temporary worker program, um, which is another example of, some might say, of free but not free labor, where contracts are used to compel workers. So indentureship in the 19th century took place across what was in the West Indies. So certainly in the larger colonies like Trinidad, Guyana, Jamaica, but also in the smaller islands as well, such as St. Lucia, St. Vincent, Grenada, and not only in the Caribbean, in places like South Africa, Fiji, Mauritius, and the Indian Ocean. And indentured laborers were diverse in origins. So they also came from Portugal, China, Malta, Africa. But the majority of indentured laborers in the Caribbean were from India. And when I say India, I don't mean India in the present day sense. I mean India under British rule, so including what is now Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal. And if I can just, should I go on?
Yes.
Or? Okay.
Yeah,
So,
please.
sorry.
Yeah. I was just going to say Sri Lanka. Yeah, sorry.
Yes. So it's considered a particularly harsh system because colonial rule under the British meant that a lot of rural peasants were facing starvation, were having difficulty finding employment, skilled craftsmen as well. They were facing repression, vulnerabilities, and so they became rootless and were forced to sell what was left. That was their bodily labor, and to sell that overseas. So this idea that you mentioned, Dipali, of a new system of slavery, people often think about Hugh Tinker's book in 1974 of that title, but we can actually trace it back to the Anti-Slavery Society, who fought for the emancipation of African enslaved labor. And they first used that term because they were concerned about indentureship. Right? They were concerned about it being a direct replacement for enslaved labor, but just from a different source. I'd say it also connects to the largest slave uprising, in one of the largest slave uprisings in the British Empire, which is the Demerara slave uprising in what is now Guyana, which occurred on plantations owned by John Gladstone. And John Gladstone has notoriety because he received the largest compensation payout after slavery ended. He used that money to ship the first batch of indentured laborers from Calcutta to the Caribbean, where they landed and worked on the same plantations that were part of the Demerara uprising. So there is this link between, or an entwined history between slavery and indentureship. So the challenge then is, when we talk about this kind of entwined history, is that how do we not talk about it in terms of sameness, although there are links to plantations and to coercive, disciplinary tactics, and through long distance shipment of labor, but not under the same regimes of domination.
I think that's a really good point of being very careful with language and not to use, a kind of language of sameness between the two. Can you just give a sense of when indentured workers came from India to the Caribbean? So what date are we talking about?
Sorry. So as soon as emancipation ended, basically, so 1838, so on the heels of emancipation, and officially the last contracts were canceled in 1920.
And so, oftentimes when we talk about indentured labor, it's often men who get imaged and written about or talked about, but women certainly played a role. And this is the kind of imagery, Heidi, you've certainly brought out in your work. So, Nalini, can you give a little bit of a sense of how women fit into that? And Heidi, if you want to comment on that also.
You're right. So most of the indentured laborers who came, the majority were men. And I should say that under the system of indentureship, uh, laborers were being recruited. So not families. It wasn't like a family sponsorship program. Um, it was individual laboring units. So this meant that often women would be traveling alone, recruited as laborers. So in terms of a ratio, it's roughly 1/4 to 1/3 of passengers on a given ship would be women entering into indentureship. So it might be seen as unusual, or people might think it's unusual that women were traveling from India alone across the ocean to the Caribbean. And at that time, it was often thought, if you look at the colonial records, the language used to describe these women was often quote unquote immoral for various reasons, because they were widows or maybe sex workers or pregnant outside of marriage. And this gender imbalance, so if, say roughly 75% of indentured laborers were men, 25% were women, what that meant then is that women had a kind of agency then on the plantations. They could, if a marriage was falling apart, they could easily find, another partner. They could have multiple partners. But for this agency, they paid a high price. And again, if you look at the colonial records, the language is talks about an epidemic of quote unquote wife murders. Um, and then if you look at it in terms of India, anti-colonial nationalists who felt that indentureship was a stain on India thought that specifically indentureship was leading to sexual exploitation of Indian women and was a kind of violation against Mother India. Um, and then if we think about it in the context of the Caribbean, there's this kind of longstanding perception, I guess, of women in the Caribbean being, quote unquote, loose or unruly in the best sense. And that's a world that both African and Indian women inhabit. So I guess in thinking about or in looking at these wonderful images that Heidi has illuminated from the archives, we might think about why have so many of these women remained, as Heidi has said, anonymous and unnamed to history, and maybe when we look at these images, we might wonder, what were their experiences on the ship, on the plantation? Where's the evidence of the lives they lived? And I think it's incredible that Heidi's pushing the medium of ceramics to give us this revitalized understanding of the past.
Thank you so much, Nalini. And I was just taking notes because there's always more to learn. You have such a profound knowledge. But one of the things that really struck me in answer to your question, to Polly, that really kind of moved me, Gayatri Bahadur, who's written the book Coolie Woman. It's incredible story of her own great great grandmother who landed in Guyana. In fact, Runia did land in Guyana. Um, and I guess what I wanted to say was the thing that struck me in the book was that these women didn't get paid, often didn't receive their wages unless they reached their daily quota of cutting 2 tons of cane a day. And that it's just so profound to, it almost moves me to tears to think about the physical labor. It's not that the women came to make babies, they came to work. You know, they were working very hard. And also to your point about one of the things that got me excited in questioning out the anonymization was I had met Amar Wahab, who's an academic at York University, and he had lent me his binder of postcards that he had saved and collected himself. And I noticed that on many of the postcards, in fact, if you look closely on I think some of the images on the many of the images on the illuminated, they say, you know, Trinidadian Hindu type woman or Coolie woman or Guyanese woman. And that again is more as a further sort of objectification of the women, and then taking them out of their work dress and clothing and putting them in fancy, again exoticized Western or sorry South Asian garb, to sort of kind of attract a Western audience. So the images were taken largely by Western American, Western French or European photographers, and they often had like a backdrop or not, and they would stage and make up these women and photograph them and use them for, because industrialization and travel was just starting by ship, and the islands were trying to attract Western tourists. Say, come and see these beautiful, beautiful exotic women we have here in the Caribbean. And I wanted to show that off.
Just showing another slide of one of these kinds of early photographs, studio photographs of Indian women in the Caribbean called Coolie Bells. And I guess I'm wanting to know a little more about where you sourced your images, Heidi, for this work, particularly illuminated, and why exactly. You started talking a little bit, but just like why were these images made? They're certainly not showing the women as workers.
Hmm. Right. Yeah. So back to what I was saying, as they were made to as marketing tools and promotional tools. And yes, I love that image. So yes, as I mentioned, Amar lent me his catalog, and that's largely where I sourced the images for this series. And these are three of the larger full set of 15. Lanterns, if you will, or light boxes. Um, and just to be clear, the lanterns that they would have used back then in their homes would not have looked like this. In fact, they would have likely have been bottles with, wicks and oil. So I sourced from a friend's collection. I also eventually I did get access, thank you to the AGO, to the Michael Goldfarb collection of West Indian ephemera, which is certainly the largest collection a largest collection of West Caribbean ephemera in North America. And they have a subsection that do represent the Indo Caribbean community. And I also sourced online. There's quite a bit online that you can access. And yeah, I mean, I'm just it really, working with these images has really given me a sensitivity to how image can speak and an archive can speak. And I was particularly drawn to the writing of Ariella Azoulay, who does talk about this notion of imperialism and the contract that's made between the subject and the photographer and the viewer, and all of the context that engages, much of which Nalini has just outlined for us, in sort of the socio cultural, political, and historical context, of the situation.
So this is a really good segue, to say that, when I was considering these works for acquiring into the ROM's collection, I had to write up an extensive application, and there's this whole process involved to acquire works. And part of it is as I turned to Nalini to actually write a letter of support for my application. And so, Nalini, I'm going to put you on the spot, and I'm going to share a quote that you had written in that letter that really, going back and reading it again, struck me as so, so relevant to the conversation that we're having here. And you basically said, and here you're trying to support the acquisition of Heidi's works into the ROM's collection. You say that indentureship shaped the demography, economies, and cultures of all countries involved, yet remains a vastly under-considered phenomenon. In an effort to counter reductive historical accounts and essentialist framing of indentured subjects, Heidi McKenzie's contemporary cultural production explores the memories of descendants of indentured laborers through artistic representation. Given the absence or missing voices of the indentured in the archives, creative attention can reveal a presence. So I want you to talk a little bit about what are the archives of Indian indenture in the Caribbean, and how to fill the silent spaces in the archives with their voices.
Thank you for highlighting that. I'd forgotten that I'd said that, and it sounds so good to hear it.
You quickly write it down and publish it somewhere.
And also, it was really interesting listening to Heidi speak about the postcards. And as I was listening to you, Heidi, I just thought, I wish we had footage of you sifting through the ephemera and selecting the postcards. And, I'm so drawn to that process because the archives are seductive, right? Like I get sucked into it. And in the Caribbean, when I look at the archives of indentureship, there's something about the tactile experience of touching those fragile papers that start to crumble at your touch. The immigration passes, for example, are held in the Caribbean, but the colonial commissions of inquiry or memorandums, minutes regarding policy, that is held in London. There's also commissions of inquiry held in the Bengal archives, and some in the Indian National Archives, and scattered across the other countries where the archives are held. So there's a kind of archipelago of archives too that gives us a sense of this fragmented history. I think of when I, think about, again, thinking about what Heidi said about reminding us that we might look at these images of these women adorned in saris and finery, that saris are not what they wore when they were cutting cane on the plantation. So Ramabai Espinat reminds us that we have to think about the feminist epistemology of being a cane cutter. And one way maybe to think about that is what Saidiya Hartman, the well-known Black Studies scholar, she gives us a tool called critical fabulation, where we might combine what we have in these colonial archives with imaginative visualizations, imaginative storytelling to fill in the gaps, the repressions, the silences in the archive. So when I think of what the work of visual arts might do as a response to the archives, we might think about the ways in which artists can help us shift the gaze away from the way, the colonizer would have seen these women or have a particular way of looking at Indian women during this period, and to see beyond or to see through those colonial images, to imagine the lives, the connections, the ways of being, to facilitate our reviewing of the images and our revisiting of this history.
So it's the space of imagination that really allows us to fill the archive with their voices in some ways.
Yeah, because what is present in the archive is not the full story.
Yeah.
And, there's something really generative about dwelling in that space that might seem absent or silent, but actually, can generate a new retelling.
I I just say that I loved what you just said, that you know uh, the absence in the archive, and that's what's not told, because there's a direct parallel to art. I mean, that's what art is. Art is, well, in my mind, art is about inviting the viewer to fill in the absences and reflect and use their imagination and their life experience to engage with the art. So there's that nice parallel.
And so, speaking of which, Heidi, we've seen these particular works that are connecting to your history, but they are part of a larger body of work, really talking about family histories, not only of yours, but also other people that you've been able to access stories. So, can you talk a little bit about the other works the larger body of work, I guess, and I'll go on to this slide and speak a
Sure.
little.
Yeah. So this piece also comes from a similar drive to want to illuminate the voices of women, and particularly the little known stories of Indo-Caribbean women. And it was created for an exhibition at the Gardner Museum called Reclaimed Indo-Caribbean Her Stories. And a part of this piece of work, you'll see a QR code on the screen, links you to the Gardner's website, where you can see 3-minute videos that I shot of these women locating themselves in the diaspora and telling us a little bit of a story about the female ancestor, the portrait of their female ancestor that they are holding. And I took the photographs. So there was a very deliberate and intentional process around me as a woman who claims and reclaims my Indo-Caribbean heritage through my paternal side, and me taking them as a woman. Uh, and giving agency to these women to wear what they'd like to wear. And I made it, and to choose the location they wanted to be photographed in, because all of those things were taken away from the Coolie Bells. So there's that reference to kind of reclaim and give back. And I mean, I'm not sure what else. I mean, I could talk to you about some of the individual people, but that's the piece that it looks like it might be not a ceramic work, but in fact, those are hand rolled porcelain tiles, and they are lit by LED. And the pigment that gives the photography color, I had to go to. There's only one place in North America where I could generate that large of an image, made out of the ceramic underglazes in the CMKY mix to create those kinds of images. So that's what this piece is about. It's about holding ancestry and giving voice to Indo-Caribbean contemporary women.
And correct me if I'm wrong, I think all these women are Toronto based, and I'm very happy to say I think at least one of them is with us here today.
Yes, they're all from the Greater Toronto area. And yes, I think I saw the woman on the far left wave out, Lancelyn Raymond Waters. And I'm not sure who else is here. Possibly, oh, Shanta has just waved out. Shanta's here. And Nalini, you just referenced uh, um,
Ramabai.
Ramabai Espinay, and Ramabai is there, the third one in from the left, and she's actually a cousin of mine through marriage, not a blood cousin, but through marriage, and I met her through my husband. about 30 years ago. And she's a Caribbean academic here at University of Toronto, novelist, essayist, and poet. Um, and it was really Ramabai whom I started reaching out to and talking over this idea. And she was very encouraging, and she helped me reach out and kind of create this network because these are not my friends. These are people, besides Ramabai, these are people that I didn't know that I really wanted to get a broad representation from Jamaica, Guyana, Trinidad. I wanted to have somebody in their 20s, someone in their 30s, someone in their 40s, and their 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80, which I do have. And I wanted to have a broad cross section of, artists, artists and academics, not just my world, but people working. Shanta is a real estate agent, for example. There's students, there's activists, there's the woman who works at the roadie shop around the corner. There's gay activist. We have a broad range, a philanthropist, and yeah, broad range.
I just want to share with people some of the other works also that are part of this body of work. So if we can go through these somewhat quickly.
Sure. Yes, time moving on. So this is in correspondence to the contemporary, and this is the historical, and these are archival collages that I created and printed on porcelain panes, and they're two-sided specifically so people can walk around them and consider the I guess the impact and the history and to see these women. There's in fact the relatives, the bottom left pane on the left side are direct relatives of Lancelyn Raymond Waters, and they are dressed up um, to have their photos done where they would not have normally been wearing those, that they would have been wearing Western clothing under normal circumstances. And then the postcards interspersed to sort of underscore the commodification, really, I guess, of image. Yeah.
Now this one.
Right. So you might have seen, and I should have just pointed out, and I did invite these women in holding ancestry to wear a piece of jewelry. So jewelry then, and I'm sure Nalini has probably can make a comment about it, but the women wore their earnings on their bodies. So some of the indentured workers were silversmiths, and they had their earnings, their shillings made into jewelry, and they wore it largely because they were not, they couldn't access the banks because they were illiterate. And so they wore their earnings, and they would often have these coins, necklaces. And so this is an abstraction of the coin necklaces that references that tradition.
And just give a sense of scale, like how large are these? So people get a
The largest piece is 14 inches in diameter on the two ends, and they're fairly narrow. They're kind of constructed in what we would call pillow fashion for in ceramics world. So yeah, they're
great. This one.
This piece was one of the early pieces that got me really drawn into archive when I an image, and when I first discovered this idea of the sepia referencing archive. And these are all family photographs of my own. And I set up a game around building blocks, and the rules were each piece has to have an equal number of maternal and paternal ancestors. They all have to have happened before I was born. And you can see Runia right there up at the top. And, my mother's grandfather, my grandfather, my mother's father was actually in World War I, an image of my parents on the bottom right, who were married in 1957. So we are made up of who all those who came before us is in fact what we're saying here.
And so this piece, also made of ceramic into these block-like shapes, are actually having photos of both sides of your family, right?
That's correct. Yes, both sides. Yeah.
Great.
So my mother's, I think you mentioned in the beginning, my mother's ancestors came, well, you mentioned this, but they came from Ireland at almost exactly the same time, 1863, 64, 65. from post-famine to Canada to find a better life and farm the fields. And as the same years as Runia came from India to find a better life. And may never know what her background was, but again, as Nalini pointed out, it likely was, you know, not these were not women with affluence or circumstance choosing to come. These were women who were desperate to find a different place to live, a different way to live.
So we've talked a little bit about jewelry, but I'd like to just focus on that for a moment. And I bring back this slide that shows the photograph as well as the illuminated piece. Maybe Nalini, actually both of you, could you please speak about the legacy of jewelry in the photos and the significance of jewelry, particularly for women and in the Caribbean? Maybe start with Nalini.
Sure. So when I look at these photos, I mean, the women look beautiful, but there's also, I mean, we have to remember this is taken from the colonial gaze. So there's certain assumptions here. We might think of the exotic, perhaps, an element of superiority or linear progress through migration, or the idea of a Western woman's freedom versus the subjugation of Indian or Indo-Caribbean women. But when we focus on the jewelry, when we zoom in on it, as Heidi does, and have that, say, an abstracted Islamic crescent moon, we have, all of a sudden, we have a different way of seeing, we have a different vantage point into the lives of these women. And then we might perhaps see an imagination that is freeing, right? That this jewelry is an adornment, right? But it's not necessarily a kind of genuflection to those ideas of Western modernity. It points to a different way of being, maybe one that has an imagination that exceeds the colonial bounds, or is even, an imagination that is out of this world that we can't yet, fully comprehend. That's what I see when I look at her work.
Heidi, do you want to add anything?
I think that one of the things I might add very briefly is that, again, thanks to Lancelyn, I was able to physically show some of the silversmith jewelry in the exhibition, but that it's rare because people, later in the 50s and 60s and 70s wanted to distance themselves from that past. So really, at this time, I feel there is a reclamation, but there was a distancing, almost a shame around coming from those roots or having had to endure that, and so much of it was melted down. And so Lancelyn's mother had, very intelligently and with much great foresight had saved a lot of this jewelry, although much of it did perish in the riots in the early 60s in Guyana. But yeah, so I just wanted to add that gold became, the prestige, and that it is rarefied, and we're lucky to have some.
And I think that's a good point. We don't see the color images and the fact that all this jewelry is silver, most likely silver. And I think from what both of you are talking about, it reminds me to how much we have to, we're kind of conditioned to look at images like this and see the image of a woman, draped in jewelry as a matter of ornamentation in some ways, and to shift our gaze and think about it as this is their earnings that they're wearing on their body, earnings from their labor. And in some ways they were the bank. They were carrying around their earnings, their wealth, and what that meant, I guess. It certainly gives a different perspective. So I want to sort of shift away and start opening it up for questions as well. And so I'm going to stop sharing my screen. So Vanessa M asks or says that she says I'm interested in reading more on Indo-Caribbean literature and works. Can either of you recommend anything, any literature or I'm guessing maybe nonfiction work? I think the one that you mentioned, Coolie Woman, Heidi, is really important.
Yes, I would recommend Ramabai Espinet's Swinging Bridge. Absolutely. Um,
Aha, right there.
there you go. I'm just trying to think of any others. I certainly have read others.
Heidi, you mentioned Amar Wahab's work.
Mhm.
Disciplining Coolies would be an excellent book to read.
Yes.
What about literature?
Um, right. I'm just trying to think of I'm 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 trying to I'm running
Um,
I'm trying to
I
remember.
know. In the moment, one has
Written.
to pull
Um,
pull.
Selvin or V.S. Naipaul would give a sense of the
yes.
post-indentureship period. Of course,
Thank
Ramabai
you.
Espinet, who we just mentioned, um, imagines also the legacies of indentureship. Um,
Shami Mutu has a wonderful set of poetry.
yeah,
Um, that yes, I can't give you the exact names, but these
Joanne
are
Nochin as well. Yeah.
yeah. So
Great. There's another question here. Rubia McKenzie writes, many people, including my own family, have compared indentureship to slavery, a second slavery. But in any ways, this was not so. Can you please comment? Yeah, Nalini, why don't you start?
Um, I can understand why this persists. So last year I was in Calcutta and I visited the Alipur Jail Museum, and there was an exhibit on the Kalapani, which was referring to the prison in Andaman Islands where anti-colonial freedom fighters were banished to and often starved to death or subject to medical experiments. And at the museum, they said in the exhibition catalog that Kalapani is a synonym for terror and oppression. And in some ways, it also is when you think about indentureship, because it speaks to, if you think about so first wave, Heidi's ship, of the representation of the Fatal Razak, those first group of indentured laborers who were signing up to venture into the unknown, to cross an ocean into an experience that they didn't even have an imagination of course there would be a lot of anxiety around that. And in Hugh Tinker's book, he captures in the archives some wondering what would happen to them. Were they being sent to be cannibalized by the colonizer? Just, there was unimagined terrors associated with the idea of the Kalapati. Um, and in the first half of the period of indentureship, the terrors, not cannibalism, but the harsh treatment of indentured laborers was very real. But it improved over time. And towards the latter half of indentureship, and after, following commissions of inquiry, conditions improved. So we have a kind of, we're talking about an arc of time. We're talking about a history that, as we've already discussed, has been silenced, that in some ways, like, falls into that abyss of the ocean. It's silenced and marginalized. So to say a new system of slavery maybe links it to something that is more familiar, that people already know. It's kind of maybe surfacing this history, um, and also linking it to what came before indentureship, and maybe highlighting again those relationships between what happened before to bring about indentureship. But it's not the same because as I mentioned before, the harsh physical punishments under slavery were not codified into indentureship. Indentureship had other disciplinary tactics, such as not leaving the plantation on pain of imprisonment. So they were penal restrictions, but they weren't. Although maybe in the early days there was, flogging and so forth, but over the duration of indentureship, they didn't have the corporal punishments, nor did they have the inherited status of that's that condition of being enslaved passed on throughout the generations. That was not at all part of indentureship.
Right. So some important differences.
Extremely.
Um,
Yeah.
Turning to another question, Rosalind Franklin asks, have you explored the interconnection of indentureship with Canada's domestic workers scheme of the mid-1950s, where Caribbean women were enticed to come to Canada for employment as domestic workers and nurses? My aunt, a descendant of indentured Guyanese laborers, came to Canada under the scheme. Quite interesting, actually. Any
Hmm.
comment from either of you?
Um, I wanted to thank Dr. Franklin for that comment. Her work is just so insightful. And no, I haven't explored it, but you do give me new ideas to think about that, because there are ways in which, um, if we're thinking about free, unfree, right, there's a continuum in which certain practices or certain colonial paradigms repeat itself, but, under different space and time and conditions. So not exactly the same, but I think it's an interesting thread you give us to trace.
Can I also just say that I don't think we've mentioned kind of numbers to give people a sense of volume or magnitude. So there about, correct me if I'm wrong, but about 1.5 million indentured workers or Indians left for the colonies to work, and about a 500,000 went to the West Indies, to the Caribbean. Um, but also, I have in my work and my research, I did a project for the Indian Ceramics Triennale called Gurmitya, Her Stories, which focused more on the journey and the travel and the Kalapani and so on. But there was one woman that I worked with whose families first came not as indentured workers, but as clerks, and that there was a very small minority of South Asians who first came during that same time period, but to work, in what we would call the white collar profession. So just pointing that out. Is that something you're familiar with, Nalini, as well?
No, I'm not as familiar with that.
Okay. Well, it's something that I did come across. So
We are continuing to get really interesting questions, and I'm sorry we're not going to get to everyone. And I'm just seeing also people are sending greetings from Trinidad and Tobago. So thank you so much for joining us today. One last question, then I'll read out from Shanta Maraj. Heidi, do you have any plans to take these works to the Caribbean and display them there? And maybe you could talk quickly about your next projects along this theme.
sure. At the moment, I don't have any plans to take these particular works to the West Indies, although I would love to, and possibly Gurmeet to Her Stories. It's more portable. Um, Reclaimed is going to be up in in a month's time, exactly, I believe, in Winnipeg. I'll be traveling to do that and do some programming there. So if you know anybody in Winnipeg, at the University of Winnipeg, at Gallery 1C03. Um, and much of this work was shown in Mississauga over the summer. And at this stage, I'm looking at placing some of the work in museums so that it can be seen by larger audiences.
So I will just end to say that if you're interested in seeing either of these two works, I will actually have them out on the floor on February 6th during ROM's member night. So anybody in the GTA who wants to come out for that. In the link in the chat, there's also a link to an article on the ROM website called Porcelain Histories, which has a conversation that Heidi and I did. So you can find out more information that way. Thank you so much to Heidi and Nalini for joining us. Thank you all for joining us. We hope to see you again soon at other ROM programs. There's a lot more South Asian content coming up. I'll just mention a couple things. March 2nd, we have our ROM Ideas Symposium. I'll be speaking about the archive of 20th century photographer Muzzer Master. On April 27th, we have a filmmaker and author from Singapore, Amardeep Singh, who's been writing on the legacy of Sikh architecture in Pakistan. He will be coming, and on May 3rd, we'll host an academic and author, Ruby Lal, who will share her newest book called Vagabond Princess, The Great Adventures of Gulbadan. And if anybody knows anything about Mughal history, Gulbadan was Babur's daughter, Humayun's sister, and Emperor Akbar's aunt. And so this amazing story of a woman in the Mughal court based on a manuscript written in her own hand. So, so unusual, keeping on the theme of how to find women's voices in archives. Thank you so much for joining today, and have a wonderful rest of the day.